Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this session. Pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. It's a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located your question. And now I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. This week, we're going to change tack a little bit, and we're going to talk about something which, on the face of it, doesn't seem very interesting or even terribly consequential, but is actually extremely important in Israeli politics, and that is the budget. We've spoken quite a lot about the budget over the last couple of years. First of all, Israel has not passed a state budget for over 3 years. I think it was March 2018, the last time Israel had a state budget. What that means is up until this moment, or at least until the budget is passed, probably at the end of October or early November, means for 3.5 years, Israel's been running on an outdated budget. And basically, whatever was written in that budget 3.5 years ago still stands pretty much across the gamut of ministries and arenas and areas in Israel. We know why, because Israel's been pretty much political stalemate. We had election after election. But now, hopefully, for the first time, we may actually have a state budget in 3.5 years. That's one of the reasons why it's important, but also it's important on another couple of issues. Second of all, let's say, we know that by all accounts from the last government, it fell because it was not able to pass a budget. There's really one built-in way that a government can fall by itself, and that's if it is unable to pass a budget within the first 60 days or 90 days. This particular government extended a little bit, but if a budget isn't passed within a certain amount of time, the government falls automatically and we go for snap elections. At the moment, as I said, the budget has to be passed by, I believe, November 4th, or if it's not passed that day, then we go for snap elections. That's it. That's the end of this government, regardless of anything else. So that's why it's important. We saw that in the last government, the Netanyahu-Gantz government, that was one of the so-called outs that former Prime Minister Netanyahu had to try and basically get out of the government and go to elections where he felt he would have a stronger hand and be able to build a government without the need of Gantz and basically what he called a full right-wing government. We now know exactly what happened. That didn't work out well for him, but he used that out. We have a relatively similar situation that we have again in this government. We have a prime minister, an alternate prime minister. So far, it's working relatively well, especially between those two. They're supposed to switch positions after 2 years, and there's certainly not the animosity and the mistrust that there was between Gantz and Netanyahu. So there's a certain feeling that if we can pass this budget, then this government could last at least 2 years. So that's another reason it's important. The third reason it's important is because in Israel, I'm not sure, I'm not too familiar with too many other systems around the world, but in Israel, a budget comes in two parts. There's the first, what we automatically think of a budget, which is the dry numbers, income and expenditure, literally like a sheet that you would see in an accounting firm, how much money is expected to come in, or it will come in from expected expenditure, income, and what it's going to be spent on. Obviously, it's not always balanced. That's the way of nation states, but it's basically just a dry, spreadsheet. Obviously, we're talking about billions of dollars or billions of shekels, but that's the sort of dry part. The more interesting part is what's called the arrangements law. As I said, the budget is split up into two parts. The second part, the arrangements law, is interesting because it gives the ideas behind the numbers. What do I mean by that? It's basically explaining how it's going to arrive at these numbers, both coming in and going out, raising taxes, raising VAT, lowering this, lowering that, how they're going to basically raise the money, what's going to be spent on in defense, in all different areas, in education and health. So it's interesting in so much that this government is interesting, and I'll explain what I mean by that. for the last 12 years, to a large extent, again, I'm oversimplifying, the government, I've used this term many occasions, Israel is a parliamentary system. We have a government where the prime minister is supposed to be first amongst equals, which means that a prime minister, he or she, has one vote in the cabinet, just as the same as everyone else in the cabinet. And the cabinet is supposed to have a majority to decide any decisions at the executive level. We moved to a situation over the last 12 years where Prime Minister Netanyahu moved it up a notch to what I would call a quasi-presidential system, where he had much greater powers, let's say, than the law dictates. And he basically decided almost everything that happened on a high level in Israel, whether it's defense, whether it's foreign affairs, whether it's economic affairs. And for much of the tenure of Prime Minister Netanyahu, he ensured that certain ministries were either not populated at all, we didn't have a foreign minister for many years, or were populated by yes or weaker figures. We saw that in the finance ministry, to a certain extent in defense ministry, there were powerful figures, but certainly Netanyahu ensured that he got the final decision on many things. So what we saw to a certain extent was stagnation in major policy areas. I've spoken many times before that former Prime Minister Netanyahu was very much a risk-averse politician. He didn't like to take big steps, not in military affairs, not in diplomatic affairs. Obviously, we saw that there were some great achievements, but I'm saying on the whole, when there was a risk involved, on many occasions, there was a decision just not to even do it. What we're seeing now is we're seeing something very different. We're seeing a return to a parliamentary democracy where ministers are really in charge of their ministry. They really have come in because there's a weaker prime minister, and every party is absolutely essential for this government to survive. There's no one strong party, and every minister has a certain amount of autonomy, let's just say a larger amount of autonomy over their particular ministry. So what we've seen in the last 6 weeks or whatever it is we've seen really some major reforms, or let's say attempted reforms, because nothing's passed at the moment. We've seen in agricultural ministry an attempt to reform the system where we can import certain fruits and vegetables, creating greater markets, creating greater competition, and hopefully lowering prices. We saw passed recently this whole kashrut reform, where basically more than just the centralized monopoly of the state rabbinate can give kashrut licenses. So they basically can charge what they want. So now they've broken that monopoly. Again, this is put into the arrangements law. Hasn't passed yet, that basically you can have other private organizations which will be able to give kashrut. They have to meet certain standards. They have to be given by municipal rabbis, which at the end are still appointed by the state rabbinate, but still it definitely creates greater competition. And this again is hoped will lower prices. We see many other reforms pretty much across the gamut of ministries here. Each minister is really trying to get an achievement here, is really trying to come in with fresh ideas, which is saying, okay, this ministry, to their mind at least, may have stagnated for the last 12 years. Now let's really speak to the professionals. Speaking to Finance Minister Avigdor Lieberman recently, he's very interested to hear ideas by professionals, which simply any idea that they brought out with a great reform has basically been pushed aside. Partly because, as I said, of this risk aversion, but also because there are some very strong lobbies in Israel, and 3 of them are really going to be facing off against, as I said, the arrangements law, which is a major part of the budget. One of those is the agricultural sector, the farmers' union, which are very angry about this reform, as you can imagine, to open up the market, to allow greater competition, to allow greater imports. Is something which they won't be happy about. And that's something that's not just part of the Netanyahu era, that's been a long-standing policy for decades of Israeli history. The second is the ports. One thing that they're trying to do as well, this government, is at the moment, every item that comes in, regardless of what certifications, safety certificate, if it's a child's car seat or whatever it is, if it has a stamp of approval from a European or American or a modern Western country, they still have to pay for an Israeli one, and it has to go through certain safety checks. You can imagine certain products sit in the port for months. The costs are raised because obviously you have to pay these people. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to basically say any item that comes into Israel that has already met EU and US standards doesn't have to go through another test. That's pretty standard practice, by the way, from America. That's pretty standard for the EU, and now Israel hopefully is also going to be doing it. So that's really in there as well. Another thing, defense budget, Minister Lieberman, Defense Minister Gantz, and Prime Minister Bennett sat down and really thrashed out the details for the defense budget. The defense budget is always a tricky issue, whether you raise it, you lower it, where you do it, what are the threats that Israel's facing? So that's also going to be in there. Basically, it's been described, this arrangements law, part of the budget, has been described as one of the most complex in Israel's history. It's 400 pages long. And what that means is every article has to be voted on. That's going to take a lot of time. That process is going to start on Sunday, where the first draft of the arrangements bill will appear before the weekly meeting of the Ministerial Committee on Legislation. It has to pass through there to even move on to the next stage. Now, where we're going to see some fights is definitely over ideology. What I mean by ideology is not necessarily on diplomatic or security issues, but on economic issues. You have very different worldviews. You have, let's say, on one side, the right-wing economic worldviews to a certain extent of Lieberman, of Lapid, of Bennett, of Saar. And on the other hand, you've got Merav Michaeli, Nitzan Horowitz, who are definitely more on the left side of the spectrum. For example, those latter two have basically, to a certain extent, been lobbied by the agricultural lobby, and they said they will not vote for any agricultural reform that's going to be in the arrangements bill. That could certainly cause a problem. But at the end of the day, that's the question that it was the topic for tonight's webinar is, what are the chances that the opposition will prevent the budget from passing? It's a long process, and they've got to get it done by November 4th. You could say, well, that's quite a long time, but the Israeli Knesset is going to go in recess in less than 2 weeks, and it's pretty much not going to come back until October. We have all the Jewish holidays in September, so that's kind of not going to happen during then. So the time is relatively limited. With goodwill and let's just say a perfect voting record, they can pass it through. Will there be a perfect voting record? That remains to be seen. The government this week has had largely success. Today, it had a failure trying to pass the decriminalization of cannabis law. They thought they had the numbers, and the opposition fooled them and came in greater numbers and basically ensured that bill for the second time wasn't passed. Another thing that we've seen over the last few weeks that we'll definitely see with the budget is the concept of filibusters. I mean, the Knesset members have been, holding sessions until 7 or 8 in the morning, largely because of filibusters. I mean, it'd be almost amusing that you hear people get up and read out poems. They're reading out Talmudic disputes. They're reading the weather, anything to basically ensure that to create as much, length in time between votes to make sure that you keep the coalition on the back foot. And we've seen mistakes made as a result of this. And we've seen that some things the coalition has not been able to pass. That could definitely lead to the opposition led by Prime Minister Netanyahu to be relatively optimistic, to be able to delay, to be able to at least peel some opposition within the coalition to play games, to play politics. I would say at the moment that the chances are, I think that the government is past, to a certain extent, its teething issues. It understands what needs to be done, not to say on every issue, on every law, it's in step with each other. But this is the big one. If the budget doesn't pass, everyone goes back to elections. And the likelihood of being able to form such a government again, let's just say it's probably not the most likely. So every single party in this coalition needs an achievement. Where it's going to have an achievement is in the budget. Obviously, we see Ram, the Islamist party, needs to do something for the Arab sector. We see Meretz, which is teetering on the brink, according to all polls of the to perhaps not even get into the next Knesset, needs to have some achievements to show to their voters. So I think that everyone, there'll be a lot of posturing, a lot of opposition, a lot of back and forth. But I believe at the end of the day, there'll be a certain amount of compromise. Not every party, in fact, no party will get exactly what they want, but every party will have to make compromises. Every party will be able to walk out of the budget with a significant achievement. And that should, to a certain extent, give a certain amount of stability to this government. It will change the arena, the political arena. It will change the atmosphere, because that's taken a major obstacle for the length of this coalition off the table. And I think then we could maybe even see some other parties or part of parties joining the coalition. A lot of people are talking about that, because they understand that we're looking at least 2 years outside of government and all that means, with budgets and with issues. So really, this is the battleground. Everything else is just a start. It's a first course. The battleground at the moment for everybody, coalition and opposition, is the budget, because that's the big issue. That's the big one that they need to pass. If not, everyone goes home and we go to another round of elections. So with that, I'm happy. Sorry, it's quite a difficult issue, but it is an important one, because it really is central to where Israeli politics is at the moment, and where we're going to see it over the next few months, and even the years after that. So happy to answer any questions, clarify anything I've said, or any other issues you want to raise.
Oh gosh, terribly sorry. My internet was cutting out there. The first question we have is, when will we see religious reform passed, asked by Eric Selkoff?
Well, as I said, there was a law passed, obviously yesterday, about creating a greater list of those who will vote for Dayanim. Dayanim, obviously, religious judges, which deal with all sorts of issues relating to divorce, relating to conversion, etc., etc. Up until now, it's been a relatively narrow list, representing largely the ultra-Orthodox sector. But now there was a law passed, pushed by Religious Affairs Minister Matan Kahana, which extends the committee into, there'll be more women representative, there'll be more national religious groups, maybe even some more liberal groups to that, who will be on that selection committee. So it's hoped that it won't be so monolithic as it's been up until now. The other thing about kashrut, as I've explained, there's going to be also reform on that. So, you know, there were a lot of promises made, especially by those parties which wanted to bring in greater religious reform. They're not going to get everything they wanted, but there certainly is significant change on the horizon. But again, some of these issues are going to be put into the arrangements law, and they're going to be voted on. And the government certainly hopes that they'll be able to have some achievements, at least in the first budget, on religion and state issues. But as Finance Minister Victor Liebman has said of Yisrael Beitenu, which is a relatively secular party, has said we won't be able to get everything into the first budget. Maybe it'll have to be put off till 2 years down the track.
Understood. Thank you. How are settlements in the West Bank funded? Are there any economic incentives? And if so, do you foresee a parliamentary battle over this issue?
There used to be incentives many, many years ago. The average, let's just say the larger settlements, there are no particular incentives. There are some smaller ones which are, in Israel, it goes by economic level. So it doesn't matter which side of the green line you're on. If your town meets the standards of a lower economic level, then you will have certain benefits, but that is not necessarily which side of the green line you're on. There are certain growing and large cities which are ultra-Orthodox majority, if not completely ultra-Orthodox, which obviously meet those standards because you have less people working, then they get a lot of benefits. In fact, one could argue that the laws were even written in that way to favor ultra-Orthodox communities. But again, it doesn't matter which side of the fence of the green line that they're on. So today, there are very few, if any, economic benefits specifically for Israelis who live at the green line.
Thank Thank you. And another question. Could you please comment on the report that the Prime Minister will not enforce the court-ordered eviction of squatters in Sheikh Jarrah?
Sheikh Jarrah. I mean, that's just a report. I'm sure it's something he doesn't need. It could mean that the violence will flare up if, first of all, the court hasn't ruled. That should be stated at this point. The court hasn't ruled whether they will evict the Arab families who've been living there for a few generations, but do not own the property, and in fact have admitted and signed a document that they don't own the property. And this is what was at the heart of the last conflict. So I think it's something that no government would want to get into that situation. It could be that they'll reach another compromise where they'll start paying rent, which they promised last time, and agree to recognize who the actual owners of the property are. It's very hard to say what the reaction will be because the court has not ruled yet, and we're just talking about reports. But certainly, as from the outside, it's certainly something that Prime Minister Naftali Bennett would certainly not want to see because it's become such a flashpoint, and the international community is watching every single step here. So I can imagine it's something he doesn't necessarily need on his plate.
Thank you. From Len Levin, with all the numerous parties, big and small, demanding funding, what effect does this have on tax bills for the average Israeli?
Well, Finance Minister Victor Lieberman said at the offset he's not raising taxes. He's looking for other ways to raise the funds necessary. But taxes at this point, there was, at one point, there was a municipal tax raise, but apparently that hasn't made its way into the first draft. That was something Victor Lieberman tried to explain, that wasn't a direct tax, that was more on the municipal level. Some people didn't buy that. So it now seems that argument has worked, and that argument and that particular raise in municipal taxes hasn't made its way into the original bill. So at this point in time, I haven't read this 400-page document. I don't know many people who have, but as far as I'm aware, there are no specific tax raises at this point. But again, it should be stated this is a draft. There's a lot of back and forth, and the first draft is sometimes not even close to what the last draft will be.
Yeah, understood. Thank you. From Robert Lyric, isn't country over party and power important all over the place? And don't we all need better human relations?
I didn't get the first part.
Isn't country over party and power? I guess because the opposition is trying to shoot down the budget in order to flounder the government.
Unfortunately, that's not the way politics works, and especially not this opposition. This opposition has said it will do everything necessary to get into power. For example, today it voted down the bill to decriminalize cannabis, even though it was in the Likud's manifesto. Actually, they don't have a manifesto, but they promised to do it. There's been many other issues where Likud and pretty much the whole opposition would vote for normally, but they've said we will not vote regardless of the issue with the government. We see as a greater strategic good to get rid of the government, regardless of this or that issue is important to us. We believe that this is what the opposition say. We believe this is a dangerous government, and we want to get rid of it as soon as possible. So we will take every step to weaken it, even if it's symbolic or whatever it is. So that's certainly not the way politics works in general. And what we're seeing now is an extreme version. And by the way, the coalition, likewise, the coalition is voting against some of the things that the opposition brought up. I think this week was the first time since this Knesset, which is almost 2 months old, was the first time an opposition bill was supported by the government. I can't remember exactly what the bill was. It wasn't necessarily a major ideological issue. I do know Karen Barak of Likud brought it up, and the government committee basically passed it on, and they're going to vote for it. So out of this sort of battle of who's going to, take the first step of trying to show a bit of rapprochement to the other side, it seems the coalition has taken that first minor, smaller step, but so far the opposition have not reacted in kind.
Thank you. And on a side note, from Daniel Pipe, is Meretz able to sabotage Israel-UAE relations?
I don't think so. With you're talking about the environmental issue with the pipeline. I doubt it. I think everyone understands that this is too important, and at the end of the day, Meretz is an ideologically left-wing party, so it should be supportive of the Abraham Accords and making peace in the region. Certainly, it has its environmental issues, and one of their members is the environment minister. They have their demands, but again, I'm sure on this issue they'll find a way. I believe that there'll be a compromise here. I don't believe that this will be. I don't believe that they'll take the steps to sabotage relations between the UAE. That's my particular view. Yeah.
Thank you. And going back to our previous question, can MKs be recalled if people are not happy with how they are voting? And what is the probability of Likud removing Netanyahu from heading it?
No, the first part of the question, I would say, no, MKs cannot be recalled. They can't be even fired within their party, as we've seen. If so, Yamina would have fired Shikli, Yisrael Beitenu would have fired Eli Avidar. In fact, we saw this week that Eli Avidar, to ensure his vote for the budget, was actually promoted to a minister. And I think he's even going to be relieved of his position in the Knesset under the Norwegian law. That hasn't been done yet, but that was something which they needed to sort of firm up. They haven't been able to do that with Amichai Shikli, which shows how little power once an MK is voted in. It has to be an ethical thing, or the person themselves have to resign, but there's no real way of recording. As far as Netanyahu, there's no primaries at the moment. There's no primaries on the horizon. What we do see is a great drive by some of the major players in the Likud, Netanyahu on one side, Barkat on the other, as let's say, the largest challenger, unofficial challenger at this point, trying to sign up as many new recruits to the Likud to ensure that they can vote in the next elections. But I believe that the Likud bylaws say that you need, I think it's a year and a half until you can vote in party elections. So it all depends exactly when Netanyahu feels safe enough to have elections. I think, again, I started by saying this, and again, I think once the budget is passed, if the budget is passed, but if the budget is passed, I think that really changes the calculations. That means that this opposition will be out of power for very possibly 2 years. That changes really the perception within the Likud. That means the Likud, who have not been out of power for quite a while and are not used to being out of power, then have to think, do we want to remain out of power? Is there 4 members who now want to defect into the government? The ultra-Orthodox parties will certainly start really knocking at their door. They've already been knocking at the door, but now they're going to try and push the door down, whether they'll join the government. And certainly at this point, there are those who do not want them to join the government until at least after the budget. But after the budget, there's a possibility we may see, as I said, a lot of movement. So if that passes, then we'll see a lot of pressure to try and move up primaries, because it will certainly weaken former Prime Minister Netanyahu's position.
Right. And our last question of the day here, hot topic last week was Ben & Jerry's BDS. Has that had any effect on Israel's economy, and how is the Israeli government dealing with this?
I mean, firstly, no, because the current contract only runs out at the end of 2022. So there's been no effect. There has been effect from what we've seen at the stock exchange of Ben & Jerry's, especially in the US. In Israel, first of all, it should be stated that BDS as a movement up until this point has had next to zero effect on Israel's economy. Israel's economy grows every single year through a variety of reasons. BDS has only had really symbolic victories. Perhaps the change of perception about Israel has occurred over the last few years. But as far as hard economic facts, no, BDS has had no real success there. And on Ben & Jerry's, it's certainly, an ice cream is not going to bring down Israel's economy. And we're certainly not going to see an effect until 2022. And even then, it will barely be a blip on Israel's economy. What we are seeing, what is interesting to look out for, is exactly which of the state legislatures in the US will enact some of these anti-boycott laws to see whether they will really put pressure. There is pressure on Unilever, the parent body of Ben & Jerry's. So we'll see exactly what happens with that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to speak with us this week. For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday for the continuation of our new series featuring MEF project directors and specialists in their respective fields. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.